Hello, friends. Welcome back to Reiki Women Podcast. My name is Michaela of Heartscapes Reiki, and with me today, as always, is Carrie Varela of the Reiki Healing Society and Bronwen Logan of International House of Reiki. And we're continuing our ongoing conversation about the role of Reiki women in our community, what that means to be a woman and a Reiki practitioner, and how that shows up in many aspects of life. In our last two episodes of this longer conversation format, we talked about topics related to working as a Reiki practitioner professionally. So we talked about being a professional. What does that mean to us? What's our relationship with the concept of being professional? What does that look like in our practice and in what we're observing in our community? Then last week, we talked about money, our relationship to money, things that can get in the way of having a healthy interaction with money in the context of practicing Reiki. And, just kind of challenging ourselves and you, the listeners, to really take a look at how we engage our relationship to money with regard to our practice. And then we wanted to continue that conversation and broaden it a little bit by talking about the responsibility that we hold as Reiki practitioners, as Reiki women. What does it mean to hold responsibility as community leaders, as people who hold space for other people doing vulnerable work? And what does it mean to have self-responsibility around our personal practice? So we're just opening that topic wide up and looking at responsibility, self-responsibility in our roles as Reiki people. So friends, where do we want to begin in this juicy topic?
Well, I'll begin. I had some thoughts on this. I was thinking, the responsibility of being a Reiki woman. I thought, well, let's just cut that back for a minute. So the responsibility of being, yeah. So I would definitely go into, because that is our subject, Reiki women, but starting off, like, what does it mean, the responsibility of being, and what does it mean to be? So they're sort of like really tough questions that, maybe some people feel they have the answers to or not. But I think, my feeling on this is that being means there's sort of like two ways that we be. There is this sense of the essence of us, and that essence of us is something that is actually, we could say that that's Reiki. So it's that that pure essence, and that we all are this pure essence, and that everything is of this pure essence. So it's almost, it really is, the being is that, but it's not that we're being something. Yeah. So the being something is something else. And that's the other side of this. So the first side is just being this essence of everything. And for me, I feel that we are all that. And so we are all totally interconnected. That is just, there is no division. Yeah. And there is no self, but it is an essence. And so this essence, but then, Carrie's different to me, Michaela's different to me. Well, we're different, right? So what's that? That's a different type of self. And that is the self that is formed from our experiences in life, so all the different things that happen to us and form us and create us when we're children, how we interact, how we learn to interact, how we learn to perhaps lose our enthusiasm or show our enthusiasm and we become cool, or whatever it is that we do, so as we learn to live and to communicate and to be as in this body as this self. So that's sort of like the second self. And often that's talked about as being like the smaller self, because it actually is responsive to the world in ways that might not be, how do I say that? might not be in accordance with the higher values of the world. Yeah. So my responsibility is to be the essence, to sit in that. I am already that, right? But I have this formed self on top of that. So my responsibility is that this form that I've created throughout my life has lots of, issues and quirks and weird things in it. So my responsibility is to try to form that according to the Reiki precepts. So if I can form that according to the Reiki precepts, then I become more in line with this essence. Yeah. So I'm taking this smaller self and I'm allowing it to, I'm helping it to be, yeah, in the way that essence is. So I think that's how I see this responsibility of being. So my responsibility is to ensure that what I have formed over my life, that I continue to form it now in an informed way into something that is living this open, unrestricted, free way of being. And so I'm trying to remember that. And I do that through the precepts. But then we've got the next step, which is being a Reiki woman, right? So there are things that we form when we create this self that are in line with what we think a woman should be, and we'll all have different ideas what that means. So what, it might be that we've got to be feminine or, beautiful, make ourselves up, and all these sort of things that we do, right? So, these ideas that we have formed around being a Reiki woman. And that my responsibility is to question that, I think, and to question whether these values that I have, are they the ones that I want? Are they forming me in alignment with the Reiki precepts? Yeah. So that's sort of the basis of what I think of when I think of this.
That's really love that. Yeah, go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, I think it's just so profound. I love how you framed it in this concept of being with like one's bigger self or smaller self, and did such a good job of really breaking down those parts, because I think that there's a lot in that one little sentence, right? Of the responsibility of being a Reiki woman. So I love that you picked that apart. And I think it's really telling about how, a simple process of how you choose to show up for others, especially if you're in the role as a Reiki practitioner for others, is like really being in that bigger place inside of yourself, and giving you, some structure around how you can kind of carve your way back to it if you feel like you're not in that space at the moment. For me, one of the things that really came up in that sentence was this idea of responsibility. And I was also looking at that with a little bit more of component parts. And, if you say the word responsibility, it might mean different things to different folks. Yeah. But I actually think it is such a foundational and fundamental question that I found in my own spiritual life and process, that it was really at the cornerstone of me stepping into my spiritual life, and not just my spiritual life, but really like stepping into the power of my life and what I wanted out of life. And that really came down to responsibility to me. And if I could define responsibility for myself and share it with you all, it would be an ability to respond. Responsibility is an ability to respond. And I always go through that process of questioning myself when I feel like a tug or a pull, like, oh, I should help this person, or I should do this, or I should do that. It really comes back to that innate feeling like within myself, do I have a capacity to respond to that person or to that issue or to that circumstance, and how do I want to show up? But I think before it can go about responding to others, we actually really have to respond to ourselves. And so at the beginning of my spiritual life, or just really kind of taking on this tool of Reiki for my own personal growth and development, I found that a key for me was just really taking care about visioning and being within what I wanted to create in my life. And whether or not I really knew what that was, like on an overt place, I mean, I think I had some goals and things in mind at that point in my life, but also just spiritually, like opening myself up to all that was possible for me in this life, and grounding myself in that. And I had some pretty profound experiences really drawing in that. And I feel it come about time and time again throughout, my life, when, so the sense of responsibility can get really displaced sometimes for ourselves and others. Like, so I know in my marriage or things like that. So it's like sometimes subliminally I'm putting on, this need to be loved onto my partner. And I'm just like kind of heaping on, my own need to be loved. I'm kind of putting it all in his court. And then sometimes I get resentful. And I realized, oh, shoot, I've actually overstepped that. Like, yes, I mean, of course, I want his love. And, that's a really important part of a marriage, of course, right? But I still have to love myself. And I really have to come at it from that place. And so my ability to respond to life circumstances is really that, is like, do I have a capacity to help others? And I think we could probably go back and forth on the ethics of that, and and it's a really healthy discussion, especially within Reiki, because when we're giving Reiki or sharing a Reiki treatment with somebody, like it's really hard, it's intangible almost to relay what we're giving to another. But I think that Reiki has given me a capacity to respond to other people's problems, challenges, and healing in a way that I can do that. Like I've learned this tool, so I can help, and I can offer Reiki as a means, a mechanism to help others move through whatever it is that they're healing on the inside of them. But I also use that metrics when things are happening in the world that feel a lot bigger than me, like war, or war is a big one, but like awful things in the news, or a big issue for me is environmental sustainability. And although like I do have the sense like I do have some capacity to respond, I also can lean into a place of overwhelm as well. And I think if you're an empathic person, that a lot of times we kind of take on other people's stuff all the time, and take on this unhealthy sense that we need to respond to other people's problems or circumstances, and we feel in some way responsible for that. Right. And so I think it's really important to always look at responsibility through a lens of balance, and really being honest with ourselves, like, well, where am I in that sense of responsibility? What do I have the capacity to give? What do I not have the capacity to give? And when can I just kind of let that feeling of responsibility go, so that I can be with what Bronwen was saying, just being with myself and being with that essence that I am, without any need to respond to anything or anyone.
I love that. I love where this conversation naturally began with the state of being, and with the precepts, and just to perhaps weave a little bit of what the two of you have shared, and with the thoughts that came up for me. Similarly, beginning with, I have a responsibility to live my life as an embodiment of the precepts. Like, as a Reiki practitioner, someone who's really aligned my life and my livelihood with that practice, my first responsibility is to live my life as an embodiment of the precepts. Okay, how do we do that? Right? We do that through our personal practice. And so secondly, my responsibility is to tend to my own practice regularly, diligently, whatever that means for me. That changes. over time. But with the responsibility of being in my own practice comes that capacity to respond, that ability to respond to others. And this was something that I really didn't have. I think I've shared, parts of this story around when I first began my practice with Reiki. It really was about helping and doing for others, much less emphasis on my responsibility, number one, to myself, to my own journey, my own practice, but also the way in which my responsibility is brought into integrity, is brought into sustainability, and is brought into alignment with my own values in my life out of my personal practice, not outside of my personal practice. And so, when I approached it as primarily something I was doing to and for others, I was missing that piece. And there was a lot of, consequences of that for myself and for my practice. And so I, really would begin with that, is that my first and foremost responsibility to live as an embodiment of the precepts requires me to be in my own practice regularly, diligently, independent of whether or not I'm actively engaging with Reiki with other people. But paradoxically, perhaps, by tending to my own practice in that way, naturally my ability to respond to others appropriately, with integrity inside of my own capacity, right, increases and expands outward from the center of my own practice. And, Carrie, to your point, when we neglect that first piece of, my responsibility is to embody the precepts, therefore my responsibility is to be in my own practice. Our ability to respond in ways that don't completely overwhelm us after a time is diminished, is greatly diminished. And we're much more likely to overcommit, overtax ourselves, take on that feeling of responsibility for people and situations that truly are not inside of our capacity, or at least in the way that we're wanting to engage them. And so there's so much grounding, and there's so much, there's so much rootedness, right? And there's so much ability to root in to a stable foundation, and from that foundation to then reach up and out in proportion to how supported and foundationed we are when we tend to our personal practice. So I love, and I'm not surprised by the fact that that's where we all kind of landed in the beginning. Is like, we really need to tend and take responsibility for our own practice, so that our ability to respond comes from a genuine place, rather than a place of needing to help or to fix or to do for others out of something. For me, in my case, it was, if I can help others, if they can be okay, then I'll be okay, as opposed to, how do I ensure that I'm okay regardless of whatever storm is blowing around me, regardless of whatever other people are carrying and bringing to me? How can I be okay? And that's, for me, where we really begin as Reiki practitioners.
When I, Carrie, you said I pulled it apart, but I actually didn't look at the word responsibility at all. And I can see why, because when you started pulling that one apart, I'm like, oh my gosh, the feeling that I get when I think of the word responsibility is of burden. Isn't that interesting? And I love that you made it into something that, actually was a really practical, the capacity to respond to something. But for me, responsibility feels like something that sits on me. Yeah. And rather than something which I'm open to, and that has a natural sort of flow and I guess intellectual curiosity, but yeah, something rather heavy.
There's a it's, language is so interesting, right? And I love these opportunities to take a word and really investigate not only its meaning from a variety of perspectives, but our relationship to it. And my relationship to the word responsibility changed and expanded and became, like, it felt better to me when I worked with a concept and a word in Hawaiian, which is kuleana. And kuleana translates to joyful burden. And it's the responsibility that's inherently ours because of our beingness, because of who we are and what we've, you know, how we're positioned in this world as a interconnected part of the web of life. And it's that thing that is ours to do, right? We do have responsibility for it. You know, for example, caring for our children, right? That's one obvious example, but, you know, goes in many, many different layers. We have responsibility for it. Therefore, there is a sense of the heaviness, right? It is something we carry, but it's joyful, right? It's joyful because it brings us that sense of fulfillment, that sense of purpose. And if we're overextending ourselves, as we were just talking about a moment ago, then that responsibility can't be joyful anymore because it's too heavy. Right. The burden is too much. Or if we're taking on things that don't actually belong to us, that aren't actually part of our kuleana, then now we're stepping outside of what's joyful and outside of what's in integrity for us. And so there's probably examples that we could pull from our own life where something was either was or was not our genuine responsibility, our kuleana, our joyful burden. And I don't know if that's
I think it's really related to this idea of the small self, actually, in a way as well. You know, this idea that things are a burden, and, you know, it's my experiences of life, how I've come through things, how, you know, how I see the world, all of that. And so it's lovely to be able to have your eyes opened to that and to inspect that a little bit. I like it.
I can totally relate to that kind of psychosomatic relationship with responsibility as something like heavy on your shoulders. And I can relate to it, like, because I feel like I've actually helped people release that burden through just literally like putting my hand on people's shoulders and inviting them sometimes to investigate their own relationship with responsibility, and like maybe that they have overextended themselves or taken on too much. And I think for a highly sensitive person, you know, it's a really healthy thing to sit with a lot of times, you know, sit within your meditation, this sense of my capacity to respond. How am I directing that capacity to respond in an appropriate way and in the right way for me and for what's true to me, being true to my way. And I have, I mean, the memory I have of it, so when I had my first kiddo, like literally I remember just the first few days of his, you know, being here and giving birth to him and just holding him. I could feel like the crippling weight of responsibility for this little dude. And I mean, I was like, I love how you framed it, Michaela, like a joyful responsibility. It was so joyful, but nevertheless, like I could feel it. It was super heavy. And then I was, you know, caring for my son, and I had 8 months between my pregnancies. And so then I got pregnant again. And so at that point I was holding like towards the end of my pregnancy, or second pregnancy, I was holding a 16-month-old baby on my hip, and then I had another one in me. And I could tell you, like, I could feel it was like a crippling amount of responsibility. But it has been so joyful. And it's like, as my kids have learned little things like how to feed themselves, like I can feel like getting lighter and lighter, which is like amazing. But there was a few years in my life where I just felt this like, heaviness. And I don't know, there's nothing I can really do about that, but just be strong in my practice, be strong in my breath, to do the work, to investigate, examine my sense of responsibility, and actually get support too for those moments where I felt that there was that gap. Like I couldn't respond. I can't, get back to everyone's text messages or send all the right thank you cards and things like that. Like it just was too much.
Being the perfect woman.
Yeah, right. And all the expectations, laid on us, for sure. Yeah. And it's quite joyful to like release that too, right? And I think, and this is a topic that I don't think I was there when you guys had this discussion, and it was a really interesting one, and I would have, I'm sure, had a few things to say about it, but I think another past episode, we talked about the white savior complex. Yeah. And I think that responsibility is one of the cures for it. And what I could say is that just being really strong with what you can respond to, what you have the capacity within you to do to help shift or change somebody else. They're like, that can represent a power struggle.
Yeah.
Right. It's like we're trying to relate to our clients on a linear scale, when I think the most appropriate way is to really meeting them as equals and supporting their growth through, whatever capacity we have to support them with. But
I love that you bring that up, Carrie, because that you're following one of the other threads for me, around the responsibility that we have around whatever place of power and privilege any one of us carries. So the white savior complex being one example. And I feel like that time in my practice when I really was taking responsibility for other people in ways that were inappropriate, there was an aspect of that, of like, it is my responsibility to go save everybody, right? I've learned this thing and I need to go out there and save everybody. And what I've since learned is that that's incredibly disempowering. It's really claiming power that other people actually have, to say that it's my responsibility to save them or to fix them or to even to heal them, as opposed to it's my responsibility to share what I've learned in a way that holds space for other people to step into that power and to that responsibility for themselves, to enact the healing that is theirs to enact. And even just that mindset shift, it ripples into our behavior, it ripples into how we interact with other people, and how we what we choose to take on and how we talk about it. And I think that the degree to which we can each really examine those places where we might be acting out of either a fear of losing our own power and control, or a place where we've stepped into a role of privilege in a way that is disempowering to other people, as opposed to leveraging whatever power we might have to make space for other people to be their full powerful self. I think that's a really important aspect of responsibility.
Yeah, and I also want to say that we are three white women talking about this. There's something to be said about that too. But nevertheless, this has been one of the things that I feel like has helped me step back from that place of like, I got to save everyone and everything from all their problems, or to emotionally or energetically take on the problems of others. Is to really learn how to take a step back and recognize that by me doing that, I'm not necessarily serving the people.
This is sort of, I think, in line with what you guys are talking about. I had a little aha moment the other day, and it's something we all know, but it was just the way that it came across to me. And I was thinking about working with non-human animals, and how when we work with animals with the system of Reiki, we don't say to them, so where is what's going on for you, tell me all about it. We don't after the treatment say to them, so what did you feel anything? And they don't say to us, what did you feel anything? And yet these treatments are the perfect treatments. I mean, they're no different to if I were treating a human in that sense, in that I'm open for, I approach the treatment in the same way, yeah, whether it's a human or a non-human animal. And it made me realize how we are really on the right path with these thoughts about there is no value really in, or very little value, let's put it that way, in discussing a treatment, because the treatment itself is the healing. Now I know that, right? But it's like just when I got to compare this sort of like animals and and human thing going on, and I thought, yeah, I can really see that. Okay, the only thing is, I guess, with humans, as I say this, the only thing with humans is that we like to talk, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a valuable part of this process. And I think the valuable part of the process is the actual healing of the treatment itself. Yeah. So yeah, it just sort of was a bit of an aha thing. And I think that's sort of in line with what you guys are saying. It's like me not trying to be something for the client. Yeah. So I'm not trying to be the savior.
Yeah.
I don't have to be the savior. I just have to be in that space, and that's it.
I think that's a really valuable layer onto it, and a really good example of like, because an animal doesn't talk to us in words, we wouldn't think to have those conversations, but we do think to have those conversations with people. And, for me, so much of that particular dynamic comes back to being the responsibility to be very clear about what Reiki is and what it isn't. And to your point, what Reiki isn't is therapeutic discussion. That might happen inside of a space of Reiki because it feels good, and it's part of human connection and trust building, and setting the container. But I was actually just having the same conversation on another person's podcast, the Reiki Cafe podcast, and talking about like, to what degree do we leave space for people to tell their story and tell what's going on with them and what their experience was, and to what degree do we keep that contained so that the time can be really used holding space for Reiki, right? Because our role is not to diagnose and prescribe, right? Our role is not to therapize. Our role is to hold space for somebody else's process, and for us to be in a place of connection and trust and safety, so that the process of balancing and healing that everybody in the space is already engaged in can happen and can proceed. And there is a way in which conversation and information and exchange of information can be either supportive of that or can be detracting from that.
Right,
to your point. And that's part of that, responsibility of the practitioner to discern that. To what degree are we starting to tip over into distraction?
Absolutely. And, it's where our fears can create strange circumstances where, because we're fearful that, we might not be good enough, or that we're making a difference, or, we're not valuable, or whatever those feelings are that people might feel as practitioners, that, we can say things that might actually, as you say, detract from the actual treatment itself. And that is taking that, it's a responsibility of ours to not do that.
Yeah. And back to personal practice, right? Because when I'm not solid, when I'm not grounded, when I haven't formed a strong relationship with Reiki and with my practice, that's when I'm going to feel inadequate. That's when I'm going to feel like I have to fill the space with words and diagnosis and information and meaning making and, all of that, because I don't feel grounded and centered in my practice. And so, just keeps coming back to my responsibility is to be an embodiment of the precepts, and the way I get there is to be in my practice.
Go ahead, Bronwen.
No.
Well, what I wanted to say about that too is I think, it's always, and it's the dichotomy that gets to me almost every time. It's always about balance. And it's like, also is, so when I have something inside of myself that I've found that's helped me either through my practice or through embodiment of both Reiki and yoga, and then, I find a client that's searching for something that would help him or her with that issue, and I'm like, oh, well, I have it. It's right here. Here you go, and I'm always happy to share that, because that's one of the things that they're seeking me out for, But I think what happens, what Michaela, you're really speaking to, is that sometimes that a healing session might just feel like a psychic energetic download, where it's just like, there's just so much stuff coming through somebody. If that's kind of the way that you might apply Reiki, is through a lot of words and guidance, that there is no internal space for the client in particular to really connect to Reiki. And I found that that connection of a deeper meaning or a deeper awareness or a deeper healing that can happen within somebody's challenge or the reason why they sought out Reiki, is it only comes when I can get into a space of silence and share that also with my client, because a lot of times people they're just spinning through their thoughts and wounds and emotions, and there's not that bigger container to hold them. And so I think what you guys are speaking to is just so profound. And if you look back at like the profound experiences you've had through Reiki, it's probably because you've touched into that state that Bronwen is speaking to, is like a state of deep embodied presence. And there's so much wisdom that comes to us from that place. And it takes away the hierarchies, that can often arise within healing spaces, and especially within, like I read an article recently about Reiki being really prone to creating spiritual narcissism in people, because and sometimes it's just the way it's being presented. It's like, I'm the healer, I can go to this higher level of awareness or whatever, and I can bring it all down to you. And it's very hierarchical, and also very problematic, right? That you can go, I don't know, you can take a weekend training and suddenly now you're like elevated to, I don't know, semi-deity embodied
a great grandmaster.
Great grandmaster state, I mean, obviously we've talked about these issues before, but it is really telling. I think for me, when I really stepped and moved that word master out of my language and out of how I choose to step, and what was underneath that was actually a lot of insecurity and misappropriation around like how that like in an attempt to with like when it is an attempt to like overblow a sense of self-worth to demonstrate to my clients how much their money really matter, or like it was worth whatever exchange we're having, that in that it's our ego getting so in the way of the process. And a lot of times it relates to a power dynamic back to your client. And yes, all these tools are really helpful to get us back into that state. And it's unfortunate because a lot of times those power dynamics are going to show up as soon as we show up as a Reiki practitioner in a room and start working with a client. And so it's as much as we want to step into that practice of being place and all of that, but there's also a lot of baggage too about just showing up if we're not mindful of it.
Yeah, well, we shouldn't forget that, when we're doing treatments, that we are also in that space. We're moving into that space. The client is moving into that space with us. So we're sharing that space. So yeah, we are going through the same shifts, and, that's why it's so wonderful to do treatments, isn't it? Because we also get to, it's a part of our process of working on ourselves as well. Yeah.
I wouldn't be being true to my way and my being if I didn't bring the topic of trauma-informed Reiki into this conversation. And a lot of what the two of you have just been sharing is kind of bringing up some of the elements or the principles of trauma-informed Reiki that really help us to be in this place of responsibility. And so, in this dynamic, Carrie, that you're speaking to around power dynamics, right? We have a hierarchical society that we live in, right? And it's very normal to defer to whoever is perceived as the expert in the room. And, oftentimes what can feel analogous to Reiki is like a medical appointment, right? Where you defer to the doctor and whatever they say is correct. And there's often a lot of discomfort and, just challenging things that happen in this context where you're just you're surrendering everything over to that expert. And that dynamic can cross over into a Reiki session where we perceive ourselves or are perceived by our client as the expert in the room. And there can be a handing over of power to us, or a claiming of power by us when that is so. And so one of the principles of being trauma-informed in our practice is to acknowledge that and to interrupt it. To really affirm that the client is the expert of their own experience, that we have expertise, we have practices that we have learned, we spend time cultivating, a space that's conducive for healing and balancing, but we're not the expert of what they're experiencing. They are. And so, in that context, it's a collaboration. And, we can slowly over time, this is not something that I'm walking in perfection in by any means, but over time, we can begin to dismantle that sensation of hierarchy and that sensation of being the expert and holding the power in the space, and to step more into that space of collaboration, of interconnection, and just kind of dismantling some of that really entrenched, gross stuff that has come along with so many layers of hierarchical, patriarchal, white supremacist culture that, I grew up in and, carry. And so part of our responsibility is to really understand those dynamics, understand that there are power dynamics that have to do with the culture we live in, that we represent and that we mirror. And that does get reproduced, inside of a space like Reiki. And I love that you brought up the article about spiritual narcissism, because that's one of the consequences of not being aware of that and not taking care to track inside of ourselves these places where there is a sense of entitlement because of our position of power. The more we can dismantle those kinds of perceptions inside of ourselves, the more we will actually create cultures of healing around us, by stepping out of the spotlight and stepping out of that space of authority and sharing that and opening up the space for people to be authorities of their own experience.
Yeah, the whole thing of the idea of being more collaborative actually does seem to me like a more female way of existing. And which is interesting, isn't it? Because, a lot of the bad press that women get is that they're bitchy, right? And, that I think that's just it's like a layer put on top of us. I actually don't see it. I see women as much more collaborative beings than that. Sort of the opposite, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and that's often a label that gets put on women who step into their own authority, right? And who take leadership and who have the nerve to
actually say what they think or feel. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, can we, as Reiki women, taking responsibility for ourselves and our practice, can we hold both to be true? Can we be collaborative? Can we open space for others to have authority and at the same time speak on our own expertise, right?
Yeah.
Make a space around ourselves that lets other people know that we know a thing or two and that we have leadership inside of our authorities. It's like it's really holding these things that society tells us have to be separate. They have to be different. Either you're collaborative and feminine or you're authoritative and, powerful, right?
Absolutely.
No, why do we have to buy into that? We don't.
And women are also often told, often respond in a way of self-effacement. Oh no, yeah, I did do that, but you know what I mean? There's a lot of that sort of not really, as you say, that standing in their light, and
to avoid being called bitchy, right?
Yeah, right.
Because like taking on that label or having that label put on us, or it's detrimental, especially in a career setting. So, yeah.
Well, and I think that also comes back to the precepts about kindness and innate kindness, and when we show up as an equal to our clients, to our students, and kind of address these issues of power within us, we can also be kind to ourselves and notice when we may have showed up with a little bit of that edge, wanting to prove ourselves or wanting to, have power over somebody because we're fearful of getting our needs met, paying our bills on time or whatever. So whatever, that mindset you go into, again, stepping back into kindness. And when there's kindness from everyone, then it's not just this kind of got you attitude where you get to be judged as that all the time. Rather, it's like, I showed up in that circumstances, unfortunately that day I was wearing my small self And I really struggle getting into that bigger suit. And, you know, I'm human too. And offering that grace for ourselves, like, because I think when we do put ourselves on this higher sense of responsibility, of course, we want to act from that place as much as we can, but recognizing we also are human.
Yeah,
So.
absolutely. And I think that so much of our responsibility as Reiki women is to model that for folks and to just be that as much as we can. And, as this conversation comes to our ending point, it's been such a rich and fertile discussion. Folks listening, we'd really love to know what this has sparked for you. Have you had any moments of familiarity or, ahas, or is there something that we've said that's challenged you or your perception of what it means to be a Reiki practitioner and to take responsibility inside of that role? We'd really love to hear from you. Keep this conversation rolling. This really is an ongoing conversation, not just among the three of us, but between us and with you. And so your engagement helps to shape the conversations that get had. And if you are enjoying what you're listening to, if something of it has sparked value for you, we'd really appreciate for you to share this around to your communities, whether you're watching this on YouTube, listening on Spotify, or other podcast platforms. The more that you share this with people who would find it valuable, the more this gets in front of more folks and the conversation expands. And that is a really amazing way that you can help this conversation grow and get in front of more people. So we invite you to engage in whatever way feels good for you. And friends, we will be back next week with another conversation. We don't know our topic yet. So if there's something that comes up for any of you listeners, please do share it around. We would love to respond to what you are interested in, as well as what crops up in our conversations. So friends, thank you so much again for just continuing this conversation. It's been so meaningful that the three of us have been continuing this, and I really look forward to where it's going next.
Thank you. Thank you, Michaela.
Absolutely.
And
Carrie. All right, friends, we will see you next week. Until then, we love you. Goodbye.
Bye.